This is the first tape in what will be a large series of tapes in response to the anti-missionaries. And by anti-missionary, I refer to those that dub themselves with that title generally. Jews for Judaism, Tovia Singer, Rabbi Tovia Singer, I should say, of Outreach Judaism. And I don't have any personal dislike for these people. I have a feeling that Tovia and I could get together over a cup of coffee and have a great time. However, I think that there's a great deal of information being propagated by the anti-missionaries that is misleading. For some time, people have come to me and said, James, somebody needs to formulate a response to the anti-missionaries. You should do it. And I always kind of dodged the ball and said no, because I have so many things to do. I have so many books that I intend to write. I'm working on the translation of the New Testament from Hebrew and Aramaic. That consumes a great deal of my time. Running the organizations takes a good deal of my time. The International Nazarene Beit Din takes a good deal of my time. The local congregation, Beit Nazarene congregation, takes a great deal of my time. So I'm pulled from all directions. Not a day goes by that I don't receive a piece of mail from somebody with a question or a piece of email with a question. And so I've been pulled at from all directions, and so I've always avoided doing this. Not long ago, a Messianic believer apostatized from the Messianic movement altogether. He used to run a website, it was a Messianic Jewish website. Overnight, one day, his website goes down, and there's a message there that says under construction. And a picture of Rabbi Schneerson. If you click on Rabbi Schneerson, it takes you to the Chabad website. So we thought, what in the world is going on? And sure enough, when his website comes back up, it's an anti-missionary website. He's not the only one. There are others that I know of that have apostatized, if you will, and that, I'm not trying to use that in a negative way. It means fallen away, because I believe what we believe, as Nazarenes at least, is the truth. And so when someone leaves the truth and believes something else, I feel like they have fallen away. They've apostatized. So I really began to feel that I needed to do this. And more people, individually, without knowing each other, came to me and asked me to do this. One of them, while I was in Colorado Springs recently, actually gave me on loan Tovia's 15-tape set on a long-term loan, I guess. Let's Get Biblical tape series live featuring Rabbi Tovia Singer presenting 15 explosive programs on the Jewish response to the Christian missionaries from Outreach Judaism. This is an older set. The new set has more tapes. However, this is the set I worked from. It has a study guide with it. So I decided to bring it home and start listening. And I listened, and I listened, and I listened for hours. You can imagine, it's a 15-tape set. They're 92-minute tapes. So I was listening for many, many hours. And I thought to myself, every time Tovia would make a point, I already knew the answer. I kept feeling like, man, I wish Tovia was here because I'd tell him the answer to that. And the problem is that this tape set has been devastating to a lot of Messianic believers because they didn't have the answers. We've got to educate people. We've got to educate people. I was talking to a leader of a Messianic congregation. I won't say who he was. But I was talking about the translation work that I'm doing from the Hebrew and the Aramaic. And he was kind of concerned about somebody creating a new translation, and especially when I was talking about textual criticism and this version versus that version. And he says, James, we have been going in our congregation through the book of Acts together. And we started out using David Stern's Jewish New Testament. He says we quit using it because everybody got disheartened because we were constantly reading these footnotes in his edition that said, this verse doesn't appear in the oldest manuscripts. And people became very concerned about that. And so concerned that we quit using it because it was just tearing away people's faith. And I said to him, do you understand what's going on here? You can't do that. I said, the anti-missionaries, they use these things to take people off guard. Those passages don't, it says in the footnotes that those passages don't appear in the oldest versions because they don't. And the truth is not going to hurt people. They need to know the truth. And it is better that they learn from us that there are passages in the book of Acts and elsewhere that are late, that don't appear in the oldest manuscripts, because if they hear it from the anti-missionaries first and we cover it up, they'll think we lied to them. They'll feel like we lied to them. And in a way, we will have lied to them. If we misled them into thinking that those passages were authentic when, well, we're not saying if they're authentic or not authentic, but what we are saying is, honestly, this passage doesn't appear in some of the oldest manuscripts. Now, you decide whether you think it's authentic or not. It's up to you, but just want you to be informed. Don't want to be deceitful. Don't want to be playing games with your mind. Okay? These are the facts. You decide what you think about that passage. Whether it should be there, maybe it shouldn't. Okay? That's right. That's fair. What isn't fair is to mislead them into thinking that something like the King James Version of the New Testament is perfect in every respect, because the anti-missionaries will tear them apart. And they will feel like they were lied to. Now, the thing that really concerned me when I was listening to the tape series and in my other discussions in the past on the internet with some of the anti-missionaries has been that their tactics were not fair. Let me explain what I mean by that. First of all, there were times when they were playing fast and loose with the facts. Tovia Singer in his tape series, for example, says that Tertullian is the first to use the term Trinity, and that doesn't occur until the 3rd century. That's what he says. That is simply not true. It is a non-truth. I don't know if it's a non-truth because of deliberate misleading, or if it's a non-truth just because of lack of information. The term Trinity, in Greek triad, appears for the first time in the 2nd century in Christian literature, in the writings of Theophilus. We'll discuss this more when we talk about the deity of the Messiah issue. The term triad, in reference to God, appears for the first time, however, not in Christian literature at all. It appears in Jewish literature, in the writings of the Jew Philo, in the 1st century. He refers in his commentary to Genesis 18 to the 3 men that appear when Abraham sees Hashem as Hashem being revealed to Abraham as a triad, Trinity. Okay? You got to get this straight. You got to understand. It is misleading information when people are told that the term Trinity was invented in the 3rd century by Tertullian. That is not true. The term Trinity is used in the Christian literature for the first time in the 2nd century by Theophilus, and it is used even earlier in Jewish literature in the 1st century by Philo in reference to Genesis 18. Now, they can't tell you that. They can't tell you that the word Trinity appears in the first century in Jewish literature for the first time by a Jewish writer, probably about the time of during Yeshua's life, perhaps, or shortly thereafter. They can't tell you that. Because if they told you that, it would destroy what they're trying to tell you. What they're trying to tell you is that the concept of a triad, or talitah, as it's called in Aramaic in the Zohar, was a late Christian concept. And as we will find in our tapes on the deity of the Messiah in detail, it was a Jewish concept that it started in the first century and could be found even thereafter in Jewish mystical literature right into the Middle Ages. Here's another example. I'm told that Origen, in his tape series, Rabbi Singer tells us that Origen was a 2nd century theologian. Now there's 2 tapes in which Rabbi Singer brings up Origen. And in one of the tapes, he's wanting to make his point, he's wanting to make it look like Origen is the great champion of Orthodox Christianity. So he talks about what an important church father Origen is. And then tells us that he was 2nd century, emphasizing how early it was. Well, Origen was a 3rd century church father. He was born in 185. So if he was a 2nd century church father, we would have to believe that by the age of, 15, 14, he was a major church father? I don't think so. Most of his writings are dated around 250 CE, okay, well into the 3rd century. So it is completely misleading to mislead people into thinking that Origen was one of the most important church fathers of the 2nd century. Okay, he was born in the 2nd century and he didn't write anything till well into the 3rd century. He was a 3rd century church father. And church father is almost an exaggeration. What is admitted later by Rabbi Singer is that Origen was actually condemned as a heretic. So if you're trying to use him as a refutable source for what Orthodox Christianity stood for, then he is not necessarily the man to point to. He's certainly not a 2nd century church father of the Orthodox persuasion. Another point in which the facts are played fast and loose is that we're told that within Christian circles, the Friday crucifixion is an absolute given. Okay? There's no doubt about a Friday crucifixion in Christianity. In fact, this is Rabbi Singer's exact quotation. According to all Christianity, Jesus is killed on Friday. That's the only issue of the crucifixion that's not up to debate. He insists that there is no debate on the issue. The reality is that there is heated debate in Christianity over whether Yeshua was crucified on Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. Okay? This is not, it's not that important. But please don't overemphasize the facts. The reality is that it's not a universally accepted concept. Also, we are led to believe by Rabbi Singer that Christians buried the book of Nehemiah. That they put the book of Nehemiah where they did in the Bible because they were trying to keep you from understanding Daniel 9. That somehow, by burying the book of Nehemiah, they would accomplish that. Now, why does the book of Nehemiah appear where it does in the Christian Bible? I'm not in support, by the way, of the order of the books that appear in the Christian Bible. That is not my point. The book of Nehemiah follows the book of Ezra in the Jewish Bible, following the book of Daniel. Then they are each followed by 1st and 2nd Chronicles. This makes sense and this is fine. However, there is ancient precedent for that order of the books, and I am in favor of it. The Christian Bibles order the books in a way that is not historical and is historically precedented, and I don't believe correct, but is logical in a way. They put 1st and 2nd Samuel, they follow 1st and 2nd Samuel by 1st and 2nd Kings. And then since 1st and 2nd Chronicles repeat many of the events of the books of Samuel and Kings, they follow those by 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And since Ezra and Nehemiah follow directly after 1st and 2nd Chronicles, in fact, in some manuscripts there is no difference. There's no breakage between them, between Ezra and Nehemiah and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So they immediately follow 1st and 2nd Chronicles by Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay? Because they historically lay out perfectly just so. Anyone who looks at it or who studies the history of how the books of the Christian Bible came to be in the order that they are in. And remember, I am not supporting that order of the books. I support the Jewish order. Nonetheless, it is absolutely misleading to lead people to believe that Christians put the book of Nehemiah where they have put it for the purpose of burying the book of Nehemiah, hiding it away so you wouldn't understand Daniel chapter 9. Let's look at another major point. They do not tell the audience about one of the basic precepts of Jewish hermeneutics, that there are 4 levels of understanding of any passage. Those 4 levels of understanding are the Peshat, the Remez, the Drash, and the Sod. Okay? Any good, knowledgeable Jewish scholar will tell you this. There's a word play involved here, because if you take the first letter of each of those words, Peshat, Remez, Drash, and Sod, they spell out Pardes, Pei, Rosh, Dalet, and Samek. Pardes. Now, Peshat is the literal understanding of a passage. Okay? So if a passage literally says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, then it means an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. The remez is what a passage implies. For example, if it says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, that's the literal meaning. But suppose you damage some other part of my body that wasn't listed. The implication is that if it applies to the eyes and the teeth, that it would apply to other parts of the body as well. That's the remez, the implied meaning, the inferred meaning, inference. Okay? Then there's the drash. That is the allegorical or homiletical meaning of a passage. Okay, we all know what homily and allegory are. Okay? That's what most of the midrashim are. The midrashim are homiletical, allegorical applications of texts. The targums are very midrashic, by the way. Okay. The sod is the hidden, mystical, or secret meaning of a text. This is where you start dealing with Bible codes and gematria and notary con. Gematria is where you take the number value of a word and you say, you do some comparisons, comparing that with other words that have the same numeric value. Okay? That's what gematria has to do with. Notary con has to do with taking a sentence and taking the first letter of each word in the sentence and making a word. Or vice versa, taking each letter of a word and taking it as being the first letter of a sentence. Okay? That is what notary con is. There's all kinds of other techniques involved here. Since we're not doing a class on hermeneutics here, I won't go into all of the things involved in these sod understandings. The point here that I'm trying to get to is that there are many levels on which a passage may be understood. This means that a certain passage can have more than one meaning. It can have a bashat, it can have a remez, it can have a drash, it can have a sod. A single passage could have 4 meanings. Do you follow? Maybe more. More than one allegory could be drawn from the same passage. Maybe more than one sod. Do you follow? Okay. Now, they don't tell you this because one of their primary strategies is to take a prophecy that is used as a messianic prophecy by supporters of Yeshua as the Messiah. One of their tactics is to take that prophecy and prove that it means something else. We'll talk about this one in more detail later. Hosea 11:1. Out of Egypt I have called my son. Matthew chapter 2 applies that passage to Yeshua as the Messiah and says, this passage is fulfilled by the fact that Yeshua was hidden away in Egypt by his father and then came up out of Egypt after the death of Herod. Okay? Now, that's how Matthew uses it. Okay? Now he's doing a drash, an allegory, a homily, okay, on the passage. The literal meaning of that passage, if you look at the context, is it's referring back to Israel coming out of Egypt, and that the Son of God that comes out of Egypt in that passage is Israel. The only way they can make that work, the only way they can make that stick, is not to tell you that a passage can have other meanings. Because if you knew that, if you knew that a passage could have an allegorical meaning or a homiletical meaning in addition to its peshat, if you knew that, then they could never successfully prove that Hosea 11:1 could not be applied to the Messiah. They couldn't do it. So they have to leave you in the dark there. They have to lead you to believe that a single passage can only have a single meaning. Now, they don't tell you that that's the case, but they don't educate you otherwise. They leave you with that implication, and then they make the basis of their argument so that they're proving that the passage can't mean that because it means something else. Another major point is that they keep the audience in the dark about Hebrew grammar. We'll show on the tape on when we talk about Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, that Tovia Singer proves absolutely positively that Isaiah 9:6 couldn't speak of the Messiah because it's all in the past tense. Or actually, he admits there's no such thing as tense in Hebrew. There's only perfect or imperfect, which means either completed or incompleted actions. And everything in Isaiah 9:6 is in the complete verb form, the perfect verb form. Therefore, he says, it's not a messianic prophecy. He's talking about something in the past that's already happened in Isaiah 9:6. Has to be, right? No. And he even argues that messianic believers in the Messiah, Christians and whatnot, have altered their Bible translations, have meddled with the translations and changed the text to put that in the future tense. No, he's right. It's in the perfect form, but there's special Hebrew grammar laws that apply in this particular passage that he doesn't tell you about. And those rules of Hebrew grammar justify, through the idiom of the language, that in fact, despite the fact that it's in the complete verb form, the perfect verb form, that it's still speaking of the future. We'll talk about that more in detail as the tape series goes on. What I want to do right now is point out, he has to keep you in the dark on that. I don't know if it's because he doesn't know about this special rule of Hebrew grammar, or if it's intentional. I would hope not. I'd like to think the best. I'd like to think that Tovia simply doesn't know Hebrew that well. Verse 4. Item 4. The anti-missionaries will use the Hebrew text when it helps them, and they'll use the English text when that helps them. Let me explain what I mean by this. When the English text doesn't suit them, they will quickly pop open the Hebrew, and they will usually quite often even start by saying, "You don't know Hebrew very well, do you?" Now that tips them off, because if you don't know Hebrew very well, they can tell you anything. Now, that's not always the case, but realize when somebody starts out by saying, "You don't know Hebrew very well," why do they want to know? I mean, why do they need to know before they start telling me this, whether I know Hebrew very well or not? They will, when a passage doesn't suit them in the English, they'll be the first to pop open the Hebrew and say, "Aha, the Hebrew reads like this, and the English has been manipulated, and if you were reading in the Hebrew, you would see. And, let me show you in the Hebrew." But other passages suit them in the English, and so they use the English to the exclusion of the Hebrew and ignore the fact that the Hebrew doesn't say what they're saying. Only English translation does. Now, we'll look at a couple of cases like that in this tape series in reference to Zechariah chapter 13, verse 6, and the whole section involving Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. Now, this one is most grievous. Number 5, very, very important. They falsely accuse the New Testament authors of changing the text. Okay? They will take a passage that is quoted in the New Testament, and they will point at it and they will say, "You go look this up in the Tanakh and you will see that they have changed the text." That's a very serious accusation. And they'll make it sound very serious. They will say, "Hey, why are you messing with my Bible? This is the Word of God. Why is somebody changing this?" Won't leave screech marks, they say. I want to defuse some of that there. There are times when the New Testament quotes from the Tanakh. I prefer to call it the Ketuvim Netzarim, the New Testament, the Ketuvim Netzarim, the writings of the Nazarenes. When it quotes the Tanakh, there are times that it quotes other versions of the Tanakh other than the Masoretic text. Okay? The Masoretic text is one example of the Hebrew text of the Tanakh. But there are others. The Septuagint is the Greek version of the Tanakh that was translated, started the translation around 250 BCE. And the Septuagint, initially just the 5 books of Moses were translated. But later, before 150 CE, the entire Tanakh had been translated into Greek, and that's what we call the Septuagint. We'll talk about the Septuagint some more here because there's a systematic attempt, and has been since the 2nd century, to oppose the Septuagint. That Septuagint's got to be disposed of in rabbinic circles, in anti-missionary circles. We'll learn why later. Other versions is the Peshitta. The Peshitta is the Aramaic Tanakh. Now, there are a lot of Aramaic versions of portions of the Tanakh called Targums, but they're very midrashic, okay? They're paraphrased. They're not literal. They're midrashic. Remember, we talked about Peshat, Remez, Drash, and Sod. They are drash. Midrash means from drash. Okay, the Targums read a lot into the text. They paraphrase a lot, and there are a lot of allegorical and homiletical applications in there. Whereas the Peshitta is the Peshat. It's the literal, plain, simple meaning of the text in Aramaic. It's a literal translation. The Peshitta is much more like the Masoretic text by far than it is like the Septuagint. It is a text very similar in its text type to the Masoretic text. There are also Hebrew manuscripts of Tanakh books that have been found at Qumran. Backing up for a moment here about the Peshitta, if you go look up the word or the article Bible in the Encyclopedia Judaica, you will learn that the Peshitta also originated from Judaism. Okay. So we have the Peshitta, we have the Septuagint. The Septuagint represents a very different Hebrew text. We'll talk about that more later. I keep saying this phrase, we talk about that more later, because so many of these things tie back to each other, and we will talk about so many things from different angles as we go along. So we have all of these different texts, including the Masoretic text. When the New Testament writers quote from the Tanakh, the Masoretic text did not exist yet. The Masoretic text was compiled, edited together, and standardized in the Middle Ages. When we go digging at Qumran and we dig up copies of Tanakh books, these are not copies of the Masoretic text. They quite often disagree with the Masoretic text. In fact, something really unique happened many years ago. I want to talk to you about something that happened with Dr. Frank Cross. Now, Dr. Frank Cross is one of the leading Semitists in the world. In fact, Dr. Frank Cross and Dr. Cyrus Gordon are the world's two leading Semitists. Frank Cross is, I believe he's currently the chief editor, but he is part of the official team, the Dead Sea Scroll team. Something happened big in 1953. Dr. Cross was working on some of his biblical texts that had been assigned to him to work on. He was working on a piece from the book of Samuel from K4. And he noticed as he was reading along, there was comparing to the Masoretic text, trying to piece the little fragments together, that the text he was dealing with commonly was departing from the Masoretic text. And he was getting very interested in this. He had a text of Samuel that was reading in some places substantially different from the Masoretic text in places. So he was, found this very, very interesting. And so as soon as he got enough of it together, enough of these pieces together, he went and pulled out the principal versions of the Tanakh. He got the Septuagint out, he got the Peshitta out, and he started comparing all of these things. And what do you know? He realized he was holding a copy, or not holding, but he had there before him a copy of the book of Samuel that agreed with the Septuagint against the Masoretic text in reading after reading after reading. 1 Samuel. Well, this became very, very important, and as they continued the work, they found other manuscripts at Qumran that were Hebrew copies of books that agreed with the Septuagint against the Masoretic text. Now, the old approach to the Septuagint was that when the Septuagint varied with the Masoretic text or disagreed with the Masoretic text, the old approach was to discard the Septuagint reading and blame it on the bad Greek translation, the bad translators, or the impartiality of the translators, or something. But since Qumran, and since Dr. Cross's milestone discovery of 1953 of Septuagint-type texts at Qumran, that approach is old, no longer acceptable. When we find an alternate reading in the Septuagint, our first thought is not that it's a blunder, but that it represents a different underlying Hebrew text. You see, we know now from the Dead Sea Scrolls, from the Septuagint, from the Peshitta, and from the Masoretic text, that there was once a great plethora of readings of variations in the books of the Tanakh that don't exist anymore. In the Masoretic text, at least. And when the New Testament writers quote from the Tanakh, as a result of this, we would be very much surprised to see them always quote the Masoretic text word for word without a variation. That would be impossible. The Masoretic text didn't even exist yet. If we did find such a thing, we would probably construct some theory to explain that the New Testament was somehow forged during the Middle Ages by somebody that had access to the Masoretic text. Okay? So the Masoretic text, the New Testament, when it quotes the Tanakh, it does not always quote a text that agrees with the Masoretic text. This does not mean there was anything diabolical being planned by the authors of the New Testament messing with the text. What it means is they commonly quoted from versions, and I believe they always quoted from Hebrew, okay? Personally, I believe the New Testament was written in Hebrew and Aramaic. That's my belief. I believe that the authors of the New Testament were quoting from Hebrew and Aramaic source material. Hebrew source material, pretty much, unless it was like Daniel or something. I believe they were quoting from Hebrew source material. But these Hebrew manuscripts, like those at Qumran, occasionally agreed with the Septuagint or agreed with the Peshitta or had some reading that's not found anywhere today. A good example for this is Hebrews chapter 10, verses 5 through 6, which quote Psalm chapter 40, verse 6. Now, Psalm 40, verse 6 has the phrase in it, "Ears you have cut for me," which seems like an odd phrase indeed anyway. However, Hebrews chapter 10, verses 5 through 6 quotes the passage, and for that phrase, instead of "ears you have cut for me," it says, "a body you have prepared for me." Or the Aramaic version says, "a body you have clothed me with." Okay? Now, we are told by Singer that somebody changed it. Somebody changed this text intentionally, is intentionally misquoting Psalm 40, verse 6. Go look in Psalm 40, verse 6, you can see for yourselves. But if we go look in the Septuagint of Psalm 40, verse 6, we will see that, in fact, the Septuagint agrees with the reading in Hebrews. Paul isn't misquoting the text, he's simply quoting a variant edition of the text, a variant version. Now, backing up here a little bit, talking about the Septuagint again. There has been, as I said, since the 2nd century, a systematic attempt to discredit the Septuagint in Jewish circles, in rabbinic Jewish circles. And the reason for that is, of course, because there are so many readings in the Septuagint that agree with the New Testament and are messianic readings that read differently in the Masoretic text. We'll talk about one of them, Psalm 22:17, which is Psalm 22:16 in Gentile Christian editions. They have pierced, it says in the Septuagint, like a lion, it says in the Gentile Christian edition, in the Masoretic text, I'm sorry. Now, those who quote that they have pierced, they're not misquoting or mistranslating or misusing the text. Not at all. Okay. What they are quoting from is a text that agrees with the Septuagint. And by the way, texts that agree with the Septuagint on that very passage have been found at Qumran, among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and have been, there are also 5 Hebrew manuscripts from the Middle Ages that agree with the Septuagint there. Tovia's first attack on the Septuagint, and it's necessary to attack the Septuagint because the Septuagint was commissioned under the authority of the Great Assembly, of the Sanhedrin. Okay? And 70 translators, or 72 translators, depending on the version of the story, were appointed to translate the book into Greek and create an official version. And this official version was created in 250 BCE, and so it could not have been interfered with by Christians. And this came to be known as the Septuagint. Okay? Now, the Septuagint has a lot of passages that are embarrassing to Rabbinic Judaism in a sense in that they are more supportive of the idea that Yeshua was the Messiah. For example, the Septuagint definitely reads in Isaiah 7:14, Parthenos, virgin. There's no doubt in the Greek Septuagint version of Isaiah 7:14 of a virgin birth. Psalm 22:17 in the Septuagint says, they have pierced my hands and my feet, whereas the Masoretic text does not. See a pattern here. In the Septuagint, okay, Psalm 40 verse 6 says, a body you have prepared for me. Whereas in the Masoretic text it says, ears you have cut for me. It is clear that while the historical sources do, as Tovia points out, tell us that the Septuagint translation initially, in the letter of Aristeas and the account of Josephus, was only the 5 books of Moses, the Torah. We know, as a matter of historical fact, that by the year 130 CE, the Septuagint, as we know it today, complete with the prophets and the writings, okay, in other words, the entire Tanakh, not just the Torah, existed by 130 BCE. And we know that because of the text of an apocryphal book that's actually quoted frequently in the Talmud, and that is Ben Sirach. In the Greek version of Ben Sirach, the introduction given by the Greek translator, who was Ben Sirach's grandson, in it he refers to the existence of the Greek Tanakh, apparently the Septuagint, since no other Greek Tanakh would have existed this early, and he specifically refers to it as containing the law, the prophets, and the writings. So we know that by the year 130, not only did the whole Septuagint exist, but it was also commonplace. It existed everywhere. That was well distributed, well known. Now we know a great deal about the Septuagint. In fact, in recent years, a great deal of study has gone into the textual criticism of the Septuagint. That is, looking back into the various manuscripts and the history of the Septuagint text. Several books have been written on Old Testament textual criticism that also discuss that issue. By the way, one of the leading authorities on the Septuagint today is Dr. George Howard. He's done a lot of work in this area. However, I would point you to 2 books on Old Testament textual criticism. One is by Ellis R. Brotzman, and the other one is by Emanuel Tov. Emanuel Tov, by the way, is a Jewish scholar. He is also with the Israeli Department of Antiquities. He's an Israeli Jewish scholar, and he's one of the world's leading experts on textual criticism. He and Ellis Brotzman are right at the forefront. Each of them have written books that are currently the leading edge material on the subject. Nowhere in these books is there a chapter on the malicious or the diabolical revision of the Septuagint by the church. In fact, they do have something to say about the Septuagint, but it is not what anti-missionaries would have us believe. We can begin by reading here from, and I hate just reading to people, but I want to get this right out of Ellis Brotzmann's Old Testament Textual Criticism. I'm reading from page 72 on the Greek versions. He says, "Pride of place among the non-Semitic ancient versions of the Old Testament must be granted to the Septuagint and to its many recensions and revisions. There are 4 reasons for this special importance. First, the Septuagint was initially translated in the 3rd to 2nd centuries BC. It represents the earliest of the translations of the Old Testament. Second, the Septuagint is well attested by large numbers of ancient manuscripts, several of which are very old. Third, the Septuagint contains the entire text of the Old Testament. What was partial in the case of both the Samaritan Pentateuch and the official Targums is complete in the case of the Septuagint. And finally, the Septuagint is important for textual criticism of the Old Testament because it reflects more important variants than all other textual witnesses combined." Okay, so the Septuagint is considered very, very important textual witness in Old Testament textual criticism. It is not simply discarded as a polluted document that was diabolically altered by the church in the 4th century. As a matter of fact, fragmentary copies of the Septuagint were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, predating the Messiah, Yeshua. Okay, 1st century and before. That's right. So this concept that the Septuagint was only the Torah before the 1st century is absolutely false. In fact, Ellis Brotzmann addresses that on page 73. The infamous letter of Aristeas explains in great detail how the Greek Old Testament came to be, but many of the details are undoubtedly apocryphal. Nevertheless, certain historical facts may be gleaned from the letter. These include the location, Alexandria, Egypt, and the time, during the time of Ptolemy Philadelphus, 285 to 246 BC, the initial extent, the Pentateuch, and the parties involved, the Jews, and the nature of the effort, an officially sanctioned effort aimed at synagogue worship and instruction. That's very important. The Septuagint was an officially sanctioned effort. Other Old Testament books were undoubtedly translated at a somewhat later time, with the entire process completed no later than 150 BC. We know that's the case because, as I said earlier, there we found Septuagint. We found reference to the Septuagint in the Greek version of Ben Sirach, referred to by Ben Sirach's grandson, who translates the book into Greek. In the introduction, he refers in the year 130 BC to the existence of the Septuagint as containing the law, the prophets, and the writings. So by 130, the Septuagint was a well-known document containing the entire Tanakh. There's another little section of this book I want to read to you, because while serious scholars do not have chapters in their books about how Messianic believers in Yeshua as the Messiah altered the Septuagint, they do have chapters in their book, or sections in their book, that discuss what actually did happen. It says, in time, this is page 74 towards the bottom, in time the Septuagint came to be adopted by the Christian churches. Since it was often used in debates between Christians and Jews, it came to be viewed with suspicion by the latter. This led, in the course of the 2nd century A.D., to the production of 3 rival Greek versions that each bore a different relationship to the original Septuagint. The earliest of these rival versions, A.D. 150, was produced by Aquila, a Jewish proselyte and disciple of Rabbi Akiba. We could go on down the list of these, but the concept here is that rather than the church revising the Septuagint to read Messianic passages into it and make it agree with the New Testament, the serious scholars believe what actually happened historically was that the Septuagint was being used, though officially sanctioned, by the way, by the Jewish authorities. The Septuagint was being used by Christians in debates with Jews, presumably in this case Orthodox, Rabbinic, Pharisaic Jews. And as a result, the Jews, the Rabbinic Jews, began to distrust the Septuagint, dislike it. And so there became a campaign to discredit the Septuagint, to replace and supplant the Septuagint with other Greek translations, and so on. So it is actually, historically, Rabbinic Judaism that reacts to the Septuagint rather than the church. Do you follow this? Okay. So I want to put to bed forever the concept that the Septuagint is a product of the church. The Septuagint was a product, an officially sanctioned product of Judaism, starting around 250 BCE and being completed by 150 BCE. That the church came to adopt it, okay, because they were using it with their Greek New Testament as a companion document, and they were using it in messianic debates, trying to prove Yeshua was the Messiah. And in those, because of the fact that the Septuagint was being used in those debates, Jewish scholars came to distrust and look on it with distrust and disfavor. They suddenly didn't like that Septuagint text anymore and began to replace it with other versions. Okay. It is misleading to lead people to believe that the Septuagint beyond the Torah, the book of Isaiah, for example, in the Septuagint, is a product of the church. That is false. The Septuagint version of Isaiah existed by 150 BCE, and it was officially, is generally regarded as having been officially sanctioned. Okay. Now, leaving that aside, I want to talk about another issue here. That is that in his set of tapes, Rabbi Singer constantly accuses New Testament authors and Messianic apologists both of changing the text, and also Bible translators. Throughout his series, you will hear him making accusations that they changed the text. Now, of course, in this series, we're going to go over most of those, or perhaps all of them, and show how they didn't change anything. They were using another version. We've already talked about that here earlier. Okay, so these accusations are in fact false. The translation issues are another issue, but more or less those are generally false, and it's both sides of the fence. In this tape series, we will also show places where rabbinic Jewish translators have fudged in translation in various passages also to try and make something fit their view. But I want to talk about something that's much more serious. With all these accusations, I want to make something very clear. Singer has this tendency to uphold the Masoretic text as the end-all of the Hebrew text of the Tanakh. The Masoretic text is it. Singer doesn't even mention any other version or text other than to put it down. Now, Singer, however, becomes very upset when he perceives that someone is tampering with the text or changing the text. Gets very upset about that, says he wants to leave screech marks. In other words, he wants to just peel out and leave that behind. Doesn't want to have anything to do with someone tampering with the text. If somebody were to change the text, even if their excuse was that they didn't want you to be confused by something, they wanted to clarify something for you, he doesn't buy into that. And I don't blame him. He's right. I agree with him on that. However, the Masoretic text itself contains 134 places where the Masoretes admit in their footnotes in the Masorah. Okay, the Masorah is the essentially what we would call footnotes today, the notations that they made. And according to these notations that they made, there were 134 places where the Tetragrammaton, the sacred name Yud-He Vav-He, was changed to Adonai in the text. I'm not talking about how the tradition of reading Adonai in place of the sacred name when reading the scriptures. I'm saying in addition to that, there are 134 places